It is the Saturday Coffee Klatch with yours truly, Robert Reich, and most importantly, with Heather Lofthouse, who keeps not only the coffee flowing, but more importantly, the conversation flowing. Heather, what are we going to talk about today? This is our opportunity to highlight the high points and low points of the week.
Thank you. I wish I had more high points. We are going to talk about the Supreme Court agreeing to hear Donald Trump's immunity case. How about Putin, what he's up to, his latest threats, what he's doing in terms of our elections? What should we be expecting for Super Tuesday, including based on what we've just learned from the recent primaries? And then how about what the FTC is doing to keep our food prices low because they're high? Shall we get into it?
It doesn't sound like highlights. They are lowlights. But on the SCOTUS, that's the one you started with, taking the immunity case. I mean, what really worries me is that Donald Trump's whole strategy is delay until the possibility is that he is elected president and he can get rid of all these federal cases. And the Supreme Court seems to be playing into this. There was never an issue about presidential immunity. I mean, a president is bound by the law like everybody else. You don't have, one person in America who is above the law named the president. It's not that the president can do anything that he wants to do because he's president. Why is this? Why did the Supreme Court take this case? And they've scheduled the argument for April, which means that they may not even get to it, issue an opinion until June.
It's not good. They're delaying everything on purpose. I mean, right? Also, I remember you and I on a coffee Klatch talking about this 3-judge panel that we were waiting on, the D.C. Court of Appeals. They finally ruled. Wasn't that enough? I'm not sure. I mean, what are we doing here where the Supreme Court is now looking at this and hearing it? But also, this is not a dictatorship. Of course, a president isn't immune. Of course, a president can't just do crimes all day and then say, nope, doesn't count, not me.
Well, that's what every court that has actually considered this, the D.C. District Court, the 3-judge court, has all said exactly what you did. This is a kind of a case. And so the Supreme Court has to review this. I think the real issue is going to be how fast after the oral argument, the Supreme Court issues an opinion. As I remember, Heather, in Bush v. Gore, and then even before that, in the Nixon case, the Supreme Court issued an opinion just days after oral argument because it understood that the whole country was really dependent and waiting for these Supreme Court opinions. Now, hopefully, the court will do the same, but I don't have any. Do you trust the current Supreme Court to issue an opinion?
You're kidding, right?
An opinion,
I mean, first of all,
just 3 or 4 days after argument? No.
And what about my right to a speedy trial of Trump's? I mean, I want a speedy trial. We have an election in November. The voters need this information. Of course, I mean, Clarence Thomas is not recusing, and his wife attended and participated in the January 6th insurrection.
It's
no,
outrageous.
I do not feel good about this.
It's outrageous, but already the public's view of the Supreme Court is lower than it has been at any point in history, as long as the polls have been measuring public opinion about the Supreme Court. And John Roberts' court will go down in history already as one of the worst Supreme Courts. It's a Supreme Court that, for example, it thinks corporate rights to speak are more important than individual rights to speak, striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, this is a court that you cannot count on. It is chock full of right-wing justices appointed by people like Donald Trump.
I know. Speaking of the right wing, so stuck in the House is our funding trying to get to Ukraine. Talk a little bit about that and what's going to happen.
Well, the Republicans obviously are taking their position based upon Donald Trump saying, I don't want this issue. I don't want any funding for Ukraine. I want the border issue to be there so I can bang Biden over the head with it during the election. But I think basically the bargain that Trump has struck, and there has to be a bargain with Putin. Putin is doing exactly what he did in the 2016 election. That is, Moscow is putting a lot of, information, false information into social media on Trump's behalf. Trump is basically doing Trump is basically doing Putin's bidding because of this. And nobody should have any doubts about it.
I know. And it is, he just takes our divisions and he plays with them, and it's on Facebook happening now. A lot of people are talking about it already, interfering in the election. It's not good. And then also he's made some threats that are very scary this week.
Putin threatened the Europeans, in fact, the West, which obviously includes the United States, of a nuclear confrontation, nuclear missiles, if we, the West, continue to interfere, his word, interfere in Ukraine. He did this in an address on Thursday, the Russian version of the State of the Union. And it's the first time that Putin has actually explicitly warned the West about his use of nuclear missiles. And he even talked about the end of civilization. That this is a phrase that I don't recall any Russian or Soviet or even anybody who has a missile using the end of civilization, threatening the end of civilization.
It's terrifying. And then we had at CPAC the end of democracy the other week. These are grim times. I thought actually this week when Trump and Biden went to the border, I guess I didn't expect there to be that much more, but it was kind of ho-hum. It felt kind of like PR 101. What did you think about their
exactly right. It was very predictable, Heather, because what did Trump do? Well, he just bloviated in his usual bloviations about immigrants and the border. Biden was more substantive, as Biden always is more substantive than Trump. But Biden said, essentially, it is Trump and the Republicans who are not permitting a actually quite draconian immigration bill to be considered in the House. And Biden has even let it be known that he is considering executive orders that would limit the availability of entrance into the United States as someone who is fleeing from, any kind of torture or military activity or any other reason. Remember, this country has had a tradition that if you are actually in danger, we at least give you a hearing about the extent to which you are endangered. And Biden is now considering going as far as maybe limiting that right. So he's been pushed by Trump and by the Trumpers all over the country to take very, very drastic action. And ironically, it is the Republicans under Trump who are not even permitting a vote on a very draconian bill.
That's it. I know. It feels so broken, Bob. I feel like you've talked about how the system is broken and how we fix it, but I feel like it's increasingly broken in different ways.
It is, Heather. And I think that is also, in a way, a Trump strategy. Yep. If he can convince America that the system is fundamentally broken, that government doesn't work, then why not vote for a strong man who can impose his will? Democracy maybe according to Republicans who don't believe in democracy, and there are more and more of them who are openly saying they don't believe in democracy, they are showing it by making democracy simply dysfunctional.
And this digital world we live in isn't helping. The splinternet, the internet, I feel like it's so fractured and it's so easy to infiltrate. I know we're trying to, take on some bigger cases. This week you talked in your Substack about giant tech, I think was the term you used. Forget big tech. Big is an understatement.
It is an understatement. I think, the 5 giant tech platforms and firms really are responsible now for a a very large portion of our entire gross domestic product. And they're not just like any other firms. They really are quasi-monopolies. They have monopolies. Internet monopolies are such that they are very, very difficult for anybody else to break into because they have the kind of unique effect. Everybody wants to already be there. And once everybody wants to be there, whether we're talking about a platform like the former Twitter platform, now X, or Facebook, or even Google and the Google search function. Once everybody's using it, it's very hard to break in for anybody else. This is a new kind of monopoly.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and we've talked about this, but the pros and cons of getting information so quickly, right? I mean, this week, in terms of what's happening in Gaza, it is so scary to learn about the additional deaths. I mean, when is our death cap? It's horrible to even think about. When is it so many deaths that we have to have a ceasefire? I mean, when do we get to this number? This week, there were so many issues with getting aid and people starving, and then there being deaths around aid being delivered. There are rules of war, allegedly, which is wild to think about. But just in terms of Gaza, it's horrible to keep, every time we look at our phones or turn on our laptops, it's more and more, destruction and the loss of life.
Well, Heather, this is a humanitarian disaster, and I do think it is a war crime in process, and the United States is complicit. I understand completely Israel's reaction to October 7th, its need to feel secure. But Netanyahu is another authoritarian figure. And he is I don't really understand what the strategy is, because it's turning the world against Israel. There was a lot of sympathy in the world and has been for Israel. But this kind of mission of death and destruction, it looks a lot like, a form of genocide. College campuses, I know, are torn up about this, but the Democratic Party is as well. Progressives are as well. I mean, you look at the Michigan primary,
and that's where I was going.
And you see that uncommitted vote, more than 100,000 people in Michigan. Biden won Michigan by just a tiny margin in 2020. He can't afford this. I think there is a wake-up call. It has to be to the Democrats, to Biden, to the Biden administration. You've got to be much, much tougher with Netanyahu.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so interesting to read all the interviews and listen to all the interviews about people who voted uncommitted. And it was a sort of protest vote. I am being very clear that I am not represented by what Biden is choosing in terms of foreign affairs right now. But some people were willing to say, I could change by the time November gets here. Other people refused to talk about that and said, that's not the point. The point is today and what's happening. And I disagree with it. But I have to wonder, how will you read all these polls and people saying they're not going to vote the top of the ticket? They'll go and they'll show up and they'll bubble in, but they're not going to vote for Biden or Trump. They don't see it as a vote for Trump. They see it as an expression of where they are and who they are in one fundamental way where they can do that. Well, people will hear. But what's going to happen? Is there going to be, there has to be movement on this ceasefire. Again, I keep thinking that every time I refresh the New York Times, but when does it happen, Bob?
Well, it doesn't happen anytime soon if Netanyahu and Hamas are the only players. There have to be other players there. And the United States does hold a lot of the cards because it's our money that is financing at least part of this war. Not only are we morally complicit, but it does give us some standing. Now, the difficulty for Biden is that you have, again, in the progressive community, in the Democratic community, you have a lot of people who are very strong Israel supporters. And you have also at the same time a lot of people, particularly young voters who see this as we used to consider Vietnam, as kind of a colonial, oppressive, outrageous imposition on people who have a different color skin. So this is not easily handled by the Democratic Party. I think Biden, one thing he has got to do is in the State of the Union, which is coming up next week, he's got to talk about this, and he's got to be very firm about, certain moral principles, like the killing of innocent civilians is clearly wrong.
It'll be interesting to see how he addresses the Israel-Hamas war in the State of the Union. I think, what are some other things we can predict? I mean, obviously, he's going to talk about freedoms and abortion. I mean, has to. There's so much to talk about there. It polls unbelievably well. And I mean, we know that's going to happen, including because Trump was on Sean Hannity saying, how about a 15-week national abortion ban? I mean, come on.
Well,
so what are your thoughts about that in the State of the Union?
I think that he's definitely going to talk about, abortion rights, reproductive rights. It's a big issue along with democracy. It's probably a bigger issue than democracy. Democracy is an abstraction for most people. Abortion rights is an actual reality. It's a practical reality. And the fact that Trump is now calling for a national ban on abortions beyond 15 weeks, well, that's a significant fact. And it should be in people's calculations. And it was interesting to me that, after the Alabama Supreme Court last week went after in vitro fertilization, saying that even a human being that is not yet a human being, a little pre-fetus, is an embryo is a person, is a child. And the Republicans listened, and particularly Trump listened to the polls, and he heard so much negative feedback from the polls, from Americans, that Trump led the Republicans. Trump was the first to say this. Trump led the Republicans running in the opposite direction of Alabama, right, of the Alabama Supreme Court. So, there's a lot of tumult under the surface in the Republican Party on all of these issues about reproductive rights.
And also, it's this trend that they're trying to say that corporations are people, right? I imagine little briefcases with arms and legs running around. They're trying to say that embryos are people, but then the people who are people here in the United States and other places, they don't listen to. It's like we're trying to, make things, inanimate objects, into anthropomorphize all the things that we don't need and ignore the actual people.
Well, that would be a good talking point for the State of the Union. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Anthropomorphization. I mean, most people. But I think that the point you're getting at is absolutely 100% right. Obviously, if you have a Supreme Court and a Republican Party that are protecting embryos and fetuses, but are not doing anything for mothers and children, and are subjecting more and more people to more and more difficult conditions of living, well, then you're really, I think most people in this country, apart from the right-wing evangelical vote that is not insignificant, but most people in this country really are more concerned about people who are struggling, who are real people.
Right. And I don't know if you saw that certain drugstores, Walgreens and otherwise, are going to be carrying mifepristone, which is the medical abortion pill. So that was a promising thing. Now, only in states where it's legal to do so. But so I don't know. I think there's movement happening. We'll have to see. Also, I was picturing at the State of the Union. I've never been to a State of the Union of the President of the United States. However, how many have you been to? This is a fun thing to be able to ask you. Have you been to them? And if so, how many? And what did you wear? And where did you sit?
In terms of actually sitting there, in one of the first rows, I've been to 5 of them. And the thing I remember about it is how hard they are on your knees.
Oh.
Because you've got to, there are so many lines where you're supposed to stand up and applaud, and you stand up and you sit down, and then you stand up and applaud and you sit down, and you stand up and applaud and sit down. And I remember just my walking out and thinking, this is a tough physical effort.
Like church.
And you're going to have, do you remember when, at State of the Unions now, it's become more and more polarized. And so the Democrats stand up and applaud and the Republicans sit on their hands. Sometimes Republicans have even called out negative things. I don't think Democrats have. But we'll see. It's not going to be an overly friendly Republican Congress, a Republican House. I think that the real important issue here to focus on, this is probably Biden's only opportunity before the election, last opportunity before the election to talk to the American people. This is critically important, Heather, in terms of showing people what he's done, why it's important to vote for him, why he's made people's lives better, and also contrast himself with his opponent, Donald Trump, and make that contrast very, very clear for people.
That's it. Exactly. Because I think for so many people, we've got to make it less about which person you're voting for and more about which reality are you voting for, which world, which, government, So we'll see. And we will come back on the next Klatch and we will discuss what we saw. It's Thursday night, I think, 9 p.m. Eastern. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit, because this makes me feel a little better. So the mainstream media is doing a terrible job about, in terms of describing how Trump does in any primary. They love to say he's thriving and trouncing and doing so well. But so you and a lot of other people are saying, let's look at the real data. Let's look at the numbers. He's not doing as well as one would believe for all the reasons. If he's an incumbent, et cetera, et cetera. What are any of the latest takeaways from anything that you've been watching about how Trump is doing? Well, nothing else to make me feel better.
Well, I wish I could make you feel better. The media, they want to treat these primaries as horse races inside the parties. So obviously, Nikki Haley versus Donald Trump is the big deal. And as we look forward to Super Tuesday, next Tuesday, the media is playing up Nikki Haley. But realistically, she has no hope for becoming the Republican nominee. She never did. Neither did anybody else who was running against Trump. But the idea that there is a horse race in the Republican primaries, so important to sell media and get people attracted to the media, is deceptive in a very important way. And that deception is that Donald Trump is, in effect, the Republican incumbent, not because he says he's president, but because he's the last Republican to be president and he's running for re-election. So if he doesn't do better in these primaries, he's done about 60%. Well, that's not very good. If Joe Biden did 60%, in a primary, people would be all over him. The campaign would be described to be in dire straits, but that's what Trump is doing. He's doing under 60%, and that's a terrible record. So you should be encouraged, and I am encouraged by how many anti-Trumpers there are in the Republican Party.
So I'm just thinking, so your Substack, I like it for a lot of reasons, but your cartoons are so fabulous. And your Trump, I like your Trumps, but you know what I really like? I like your McConnell cartoons. So in the news this week, McConnell is gonal. But I just love any excuse to see the long picture you do.
No, I'm not going to have a chance to do that cartoon very much more.
So I am so thrilled at this going away party that we are having for him, but I'm going to miss that cartoon. But I
wish I could say I'm going to miss Mitch. I'm not. I think he will go down in history as one of the worst Republican Senate leaders in history because he kept on changing the rules. He kept on putting party way above the public. And we all know what he did with regard to Barack Obama's pick for the Supreme Court. Yeah. And then he bent the rules once again to allow Donald Trump to get in 3 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court. And Mitch McConnell is responsible for not only a right-wing Supreme Court, but also a right-wing judiciary. He got more justices, judges confirmed than I think any other Republican Senate has done. And this is all about party. Do you remember when he said his most important goal at the start of the Barack Obama administration was to make Obama a one-term president?
Yeah, we remember.
This is not a Republican leader who is a public leader. This is a Republican leader who is a party hack. And that's what Mitch McConnell is.
Who's going to replace him? There are three names people are floating, right? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, John Cornyn and also John Barrasso and John Thune. I think that these are standard. Extremely conservative. They are supporters of Donald Trump. Obviously, they have to be. They've all come out in favor of Trump for 2024. But I think that Trump wants somebody who is going to be younger, more dynamic, more of a lapdog to Trump, more telegenic. I would say that Trump is going to weigh in either for Josh Hawley or for J.D. Vance. And both of them would be even worse than Mitch McConnell.
That sentence, even worse than Mitch McConnell. It'll be interesting to see, right? We know Trump's reign, because that's what it is, right? I mean, he's everywhere. He's infiltrated and he's controlling. And so we'll see who he chooses, basically.
And he just put in a new head of the Republican National Committee. I mean, not as if Rod Daniels was a lapdog to Trump,
right.
But he wants an even bigger lapdog. He wants somebody who's going to take his direction continuously. Right. And we all know that the Speaker of the House, Michael Johnson, was down talking to Trump last week in Mar-a-Lago, getting essentially his marching orders. I mean, Trump has taken over the Republican Party. Let's make it very clear. Nobody should have any doubts about this.
I don't have any doubts, but I'd like to move on. Please? I want a new topic. So the good news is the FTC is looking at this big potential merger between Kroger and Albertsons and saying, not so fast. What did we learn this week and what should we be anticipating? And let's remember, Kroger Albertsons, that means Vons, that means Safeway, that means Harris Teeter, that I've been to a lot when I visit my family in the South. That means, who's the other one? There's another store.
Well, Kroger and Albertsons together are responsible, given all their subdivisions that you just mentioned and many others, are responsible about 40% or more of grocery shopping. And that means that a lot of people have no choice at all with regard to the actual parent company. If this merger were to go through, people would have even less choice, and food prices have not come down. If you haven't noticed, although inflation has dropped dramatically, a lot of these food companies, these massive grocery chains, are showing record profits. They are colluding. It's clear that they're already colluding. So kudos to Biden's Federal Trade Commission for going after them.
What does it mean for workers? Because I know that a lot of the workers at Kroger, Albertsons, and in them both are unionized, and they claim, for us to be more competitive with people with other companies who have fewer, unionized workers, this is better for us. That's one of their arguments. What do you say to that?
Well, look, one of the aspects of monopolization that is very rarely talked about, should be talked about much more. It's not just about consumer prices, although it is to a large extent. It's also about workers having the ability to work for somebody who is competitive, who will offer them better wages, better working conditions. And one of the things I'm so impressed with Lena Khan, chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, and her colleagues at the Federal Trade Commission, is they are looking and considering the effects of monopolization on workers and workers' wages, as well as everything else. And Biden, this is Biden's Federal Trade Commission, just like it's Biden's antitrust division of the Justice Department, just like it's Biden's National Labor Relations Board that is making extraordinary headway with regard to helping workers form unions and exercise their right to unionize. Biden may not be getting credit for this, but this is all part of the Biden administration, and it was very carefully thought out initially.
Whew. Well, I'm exhausted. I think we need to, coffee's working. Maybe we need to do energy drinks. Do we need protein powder added?
And listen, you are terrific. Heather, I want to just salute you. I love getting to talk to you. This is what we do. This is what we do. We have these coffees to figure out the world. And also it's what all of you out there do. Thank you for joining us. And Heather and I'm sure, Heather, you are wishing people, as I do, a terrific week. Notwithstanding Super Tuesday and the State of the Union and everything else that's coming out, and particularly Donald Trump and his antics and the cases against him, let's just salute American democracy and our ability so far, Heather and I and you, to get the truth. See you next week.